everyone. Welcome to the Cost of Conflict webinar, how conflict affects your workforce and what you can do to manage it. Today presenting we have Michael Segovia. And just as a quick reminder for everyone on the line, we are going to send you an email a couple days after the webinar that has both a link to the recording of the webinar as well as a few other items. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Michael Segovia.
Hello everyone, thanks Melissa very much. Everyone, this is going to be a fast and I'll admit somewhat furious 30-minute overview on conflict. Now CPP will be going more in depth with our conflict management tool during a webinar in May, so keep a lookout for that. And I'll mention that again also later in this webinar. Now some of you may not know me. No need to spend a lot of time in this area, of course, but you can read about this later because we will be sending these slides to you. In summary, I've been a part of CPP for almost 26 years, and my current role is as CPP's lead facilitator of MBTI certification programs. A reminder, you will get these slides, as I mentioned a minute ago, after this webinar. They will be sent to you. You'll also get what I think is a really good cost of conflict summary sheet, which basically includes all of the data, all the resources I'm going to share. It includes links to all of that information. So you'll see a really nice, I think it's a fun video on 4 tips for managing conflict. You'll see a CPP's Global Human Capital report where we did a research study looking at 9 different countries and the effects of conflict on those countries, how much training has gone into a place around conflict, and so on. You'll also see a nice cost of conflict sheet that I think is done so well by Ralph Kilman and Ken Thomas, and has more information, of course, about the TKI. There's also going to be at the bottom of that an invitation to download CPP's first ever ebook, Relationships in Conflict. And at the very bottom of that sheet, you'll find information on how to register for the TKI conflict webinar that's going to take place. I think it's May 13. So our agenda today, we're going to look at what is the cost of conflict in the workplace, and then conflict trends in the workplace, keys to conflict management, quick tips for better conflict management, how do assessments like the Myers-Briggs, the FIRO and the TKI affect all of this. That's basically what we're going to be covering in this 30 minutes. Now, we know that conflict, it can be both a verb, it can also be a noun. I like Ralph Kilman's description of conflict as neither good nor bad. Instead, he describes it as neutral, and its goodness or its badness really depends on how well it is managed. We know that conflict occurs basically everywhere, and our data from the research we've collected shows us that we see it most in, and it might surprise you, 3 different areas. Here's one of them: charities or not-for-profit organizations. And as I think about this, I guess it does make more sense. I've done a lot of work myself with nonprofits, so we could go back to the nonprofit really quick. I've done a lot of work with nonprofits, and I found that just that stress to keep your doors open, to get that money in, to keep that funding and those services going can put a lot of stress on people. Another area would be catering, and this one does surprise me because I think it looks like it could be so much fun. For people who know me, I'm a bit of a foodie. I love food. But then when you think about it, putting food and people together, I would guess there'd be a lot of stress, and on top of that, then a lot of conflict. And then, of course, HR with people, and our lives are, making money and surviving and providing for our families and homes and all of that. Of course, you're going to find a lot of conflict there. So what's the cost of all of this? We know that it's estimated that employers pay $1 billion each year around a workplace conflict. And typical managers report 20 to 40% of their time dealing with employee conflict. And employees spend about 2 hours a week dealing with conflict. So what might this do to people? And right off the bat, you can't help but think, of course, added stress. And with that stress, what you're going to find is people who are angry and frustrated and nervous and sleepless. For some people, though, that added conflict could lead to some confidence that at least these issues are being addressed. We know, though, conflict, how it can affect employees. where you might find that additional stress and it can decrease employee engagement. We know that workplace conflict is a decisive factor in more than 50% of employees leaving a company. It's also a decisive factor in over 90% of cause-related terminations. So again, we're looking at lots of issues and lots of revenue decrease. I like this quote from Heidi Hanna, who has written a book called Stressaholic. Stress is more contagious than the flu, but we don't take the same precautions. Instead, we let stress spread, and as a result, we get more unmanaged stress. So let's take a look at a few trends in workplace conflict. First off, we see email and texting and how much of it there is out there. And you know, I remember when it began, when I received my very first email, I thought, wow, this is great. And now I wonder, is it so great? You know, I wake up every morning and the first thing I do is reach for my phone and I check my email. We get, I think it's something like 144.8 million emails sent each year. I'm sorry, each day, not each year. It should be each year. It's each day. But data shows us only about 50% of those emails are understood, meaning half of them are misunderstood. It makes sense, though, that you can see more conflict. We also see, as you can see on screen, that fortunately there is more attention being paid to both extroverted and introverted preferences. And you will see in the summary sheet that we're going to send you, there's a really good article titled The Psychology of Introverted Employees. You'll see some interesting tips from Susan King, who wrote the excellent book, Quiet. I would highly recommend taking a look at that. And by the way, this summary info, it's all free. It's all really good info that I would highly recommend that you take a look at. So basically we know that there's no one best way to deal with conflict. It all depends on the situation, the level of trust, both on both sides, and so on. So what can we all do to become, and I love this picture here, conflict management superheroes? Here are some keys. One is self-awareness, another is communication, and a third is structure. And by structure, what we mean is what kind of training is taking place, and how do people think about conflict? Do they see it as a bad word, or is it more of a neutral word? And are people able to create a structure or use a structure like the TKI that can help us read the situation to know which mode might we use that would be best for that situation? So looking at self-awareness, you know, the tool that I know the most about of the three that we're going to talk about is the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And I like this quote from this program manager from an S&P 500 energy and utilities company. The MBTI assessment gives people clarity. It's an excellent tool for increasing self-awareness and addressing communication and conflict and change and management styles. Now, being aware of our preferences and how those preferences and the preferences of other people can play a huge role during conflict. You know, understanding our conflict preference pairs, for example, can help us see what blind spots we might have that we bring to conflict. Now, sure, they help us, but there may be blind spots as well. And we're going to look at those briefly. You'll see the last bullet on this slide, thinking and perceiving, thinking and judging, feeling and perceiving, and feeling and judging. A lot of people also call these, by the way, the leadership pairs. We're going to look at them in terms of conflict. And when we think of that first one, thinking and perceiving, we find that these people may have difficulty getting to closure because they haven't considered the impact of the conflict on others. And so that conflict gets revisited over and over again. People keep bringing up those human issues, those personal issues that haven't been dealt with, and so it keeps coming up. And for people who prefer thinking and judging, they may decide too early and jump right to that analysis and being too critical too soon and not staying open to different points of views. You can see how that could relate to conflict issues. Those who prefer feeling and judging may decide on people issues too soon and then might cut off the conflict before it's really even addressed. And you know, I see this, and it can happen for those of us who prefer feeling. I prefer feeling, by the way. We can tend to create what we call cults of harmony, where we try to avoid all that conflict all the time, Now, the avoiding style can be a good style if it's the right time for it, but if we overuse it, there's where it can be a problem. And then finally on this list you see feeling and judging, where we may decide on people issues too soon and then cut off the conflict before it's even addressed.
And Michael, we did have a question come in. Someone missed the percentages for each of the industries, 43% for HR. Just to address that question, that was the percentage of time that conflict occurs within that industry. So those three industries, charity, nonprofit, catering, and HR, based on the conflict report that we have, those were the three industries that report the most amount of conflict. HR having reported conflict 43% of the time for the people surveyed within that industry.
Thank you, Melissa. And everyone, you're also going to see a difference when we look at culture, because as I said, we looked at 9 different countries, and we find Germany reports the highest amount of conflict, and the least amount, we can go back still if you don't mind, and the least amount would be the Netherlands. I think I skipped one. I don't think I covered feeling and feeling and perceiving is the one I didn't cover just then. And you might find that they may draw out the whole thing in search of this win-win outcome that might not be realistic every time or even most of the time, and that can be a challenge for feeling and perceiving types. Now, if we move on to the FIRO-B, what I love about this instrument is it's looking at our interpersonal needs, and it's just another lens in exploring conflict issues. This quote from Katie Albright, who's from the San Francisco Child Abuse Prevention Center. FIRO-B Insights gave us the language to have delicate or more difficult conversations easily, quickly, and smoothly. Staff decisions that might have taken months were completed in just a few days. Now, understanding our interpersonal needs can help us understand motivation during conflict. Basically, if our most important need or needs are not being met, that's when you find people in conflict. For those of you who aren't familiar with the FIRO-B, its name is very long. You don't need to know this in case you're curious. It stands for Fundamental Interpersonal Relationship Orientation - Behavior. That's why we call it the FIRO-B. It saves you a lot of time. But basically it helps us identify our overall interpersonal needs and then helps us understand which of these 3 needs of inclusion, control, and affection is the most important for us. My most important interpersonal need happens to be affection, or what is described as connection on the business version of this instrument. Simply put, if my need for affection is not met, that's when you might find me in a place of conflict or a place of dissatisfaction. Inclusion and control tend not to be as big of a deal for me. Now, I've been, as I mentioned to you, at CPP for almost 26 years. I've been at CPP so long because that need for affection, I get that met whenever I come into the office. It's important for me, and it's a need that I get. Now, the third tool, and by the way, this third tool actually has the name conflict in its title. It's the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument. And I love this quote from this Chief Human Resources Office. After using the TKI, we have a common language regarding conflict and conflict resolution. We understand each other's styles better. And you know, with the TKI, what it gives you is this language to understand conflict, and I think really an ability to try to read that conflict situation to know what would be the best style to use in that situation. So if we move to that next slide, you'll see some information about the TKI. Multiple people on a team means many perspectives and opinions and communication styles. With the TKI, what you're getting are basically 2 dimensions, assertiveness and cooperativeness, and 5 modes that exist within those dimensions. So competing and collaborating and compromising and accommodating and avoiding. I know for me, the one that I might overuse, and I know it's something I need to work on, is accommodating. And when I do that, the result is that sometimes people might think I'm a bit of a pushover. Sometimes when I overuse accommodating, people think I'm not even invested in the conflict. Now, that doesn't mean I need to jump from accommodating to competing overnight, but I do need to think about how might competing help me in a situation, like if I'm standing up for my rights, or if I know something is especially important, then I might want to think about using competing a little bit more. So let's look at some tips. I know that I've gone through that. I've zoomed through those 3 tools. I would usually spend hours and even days exploring each of them with people, but let's look at some tips to think about how we might apply some of this information. First off, act early. Don't let that conflict build without considering early what you might do, which approach you might take. The next would be dig to the core of the problem. What's the real issue? Is there another issue involved, like maybe trust, or my preferences versus your preferences, my needs versus your needs, or could those be really the issue? Another would be, is personality really the issue? Is that really the conflict? Now, speaking of preferences, sometimes we dislike in others what we dislike in ourselves. Is the conflict just the result of some projective act? Is it about personality differences and the unwillingness to appreciate those differences, which we see quite a bit? This next one would be wary of taking sides. And this one is more of an organizational level focus description or example. And just to keep in mind, just because one side might make more sense to you doesn't mean it's the right side during conflict. You could be putting your own biases into the situation. Instead, try to stay open to both sides as much as you can if the situation will allow. And then this last tip on this slide, how do those involved typically handle conflict? What's worked in the past? What has not worked? What might we all learn from flexing our conflict style to what is needed in that particular situation? With TKI, people have behavioral clues as to their preferred conflict modes. And by thinking about the people involved in that conflict's past behaviors, it could help the mediator or the HR professional or the manager better understand how much of the conflict is from the overuse of that conflict handling mode of that person, like more assertiveness versus less cooperativeness, or limitations on some resources that you might have. You'll see on slide 38, as we are again zooming through this, I want to make sure we leave some time for questions, of course. There is a second webinar that I hope you will register for. The title is Using the TKI to Its Full Potential. I find that so many people think they understand the TKI, but there's so much more to this tool, and you're going to get an opportunity to hear from one of the authors, Ralph Kilman. I mentioned earlier, too, that there is he has a website, kilmandiagnostics.com, where you can find wonderful webinars, wonderful trainings that he does, and I've gone through some of them myself, and I find them really useful. You'll see, though, this webinar, it is May 13, 10 a.m. to 10:30, where you're going to learn more about each of these conflict modes: competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding, and accommodating, and their dimensions. And I think you're going to get some good tips on when each mode might be more appropriate in that setting. Because if you use the same mode every time, it's not going to work. You might get lucky and think, oh, that's the one for me. Well, in the next situation, it might not work at all. So you can register. You can see it at the bottom of that slide. Now, of course, there's always more to learn when we think about conflict, when we think about any topic. And you can go to cppblogcentral.com, where you will find several blogs that we have, and where you find people writing about all kinds of interesting topics. I think they're interesting. My blog is in there. My blog is mbtitalk.com, and I write about basically whatever I want to write about, whatever I feel like writing about. In fact, I'm going to do some of that writing today. Feel free, anybody, send me any ideas. You can follow me, by the way, or follow us, by the way, at Twitter. You can see at the MBTI, at CPP Inc., and there's me, at Type Trainer. That's how you can follow me on Twitter. And of course, we are in the age of social media. Facebook is another way to reach us, and many other areas as well. We would love to chat. We would love to hear from you. You can send an email my way with any questions, any comments you might have at msegovia@cpp.com. Also, again, @typetrainer, that's how you would reach me via Twitter. And if you have any product questions, of course, we would love to hear from you at CPP Customer Relations. There's our toll-free number, and you can reach us via email as well at custserve@cpp.com. And there's our website, www.cpp.com. I know that was fast. It felt fast to me. I want to make sure we leave some time for any thoughts, any questions from anybody that anybody might have.
Okay, so it looks like we have one question from Kelly. And Kelly's asking, what tips do you have for conflict prevention?
What tips do I have for conflict prevention? I think it's a great question. Thanks, Kelly, for that. You know, I think the big part of it is understanding and appreciating differences. And all three of these tools that we're talking about can help us understand and appreciate differences. So often we look at someone and right away our impression is, that person drives me crazy, or that person is doing that to get under my skin. And it's not usually the case. Now it can be, but it's not usually meant to be the case. So if we can just try to stay open to differences and really learn to try to celebrate the differences in others, ask people why they're coming at you the way they are, what they're saying and why they're saying it. And what you can do from all of that is then learn to incorporate those differences into how you take in information, how you make decisions, how you understand your needs and the needs of other people, and what would be the appropriate conflict mode to use in that situation. Kelly and everybody else, it does remind me that I just did a TED Talk. It was a TEDx talk done a couple of weeks ago, and that will be available online. I'm hoping early May, so you can keep a lookout for it. But basically, the focus of that talk is about celebrating differences. And I really think that's how I would answer your question, Kelly, the most. It's understanding, appreciating, celebrating differences in others.
Great. And we have another question from Delia, and it's, would you recommend, generally speaking, the integration of all three of these assessments that you mentioned, the three being the Myers-Briggs assessment, the FIRO-B assessment, and the TKI?
Yeah, Delia, I think thanks for that question. I like using a battery of tools. I'm not a fan of using just one instrument and thinking it's going to solve everything for me. And I find people, when they do that, they don't really understand what those instruments do and what they don't do. So I like using the Myers-Briggs, the FIRO-B, and the TKI. I would even add another tool, the CPI, to that mix. Now, one thing I will say, when I use a battery of tools, there's an order that I like to have them administered in. So, for example, if I'm using the Myers-Briggs and the FIRO-B, I always have people answer the questions in the Myers-Briggs first, then answer the questions on the FIRO-B. Because the FIRO-B questions look like they're trying to trick you. They're not. What people will say is, well, I answered the same question over and over again. It was trying to trick me. Well, what you answered was a question that every time was just a little bit more extreme. And so eventually what happens is you opt out. But if you have that suspicious sort of mindset and then you take the Myers-Briggs, it might influence your results. Because we all know with the Myers-Briggs, we want you to answer those questions in what we call your shoes off self. And by that we mean remove any roles and expectations you have at work and remove any roles and expectations you have at home and just answer what you prefer. Now, I would give the TKI either before or after the MBTI, but wait, give the FIRO-B a little bit later and then the CPI. Now, we do have data that shows that there are correlations with these instruments. For example, when you look at extroversion and introversion, and you look at an instrument like the FIRO-B, there are correlations with expressed inclusion and wanted inclusion with extroversion. You would expect to see that. And when you look at, for example, affection on the FIRO-B, you would expect that to correlate with, what do you think, thinking or feeling? Well, yeah, I think you'd be right that the answer would be feeling. We also have correlations with the Myers-Briggs and the TKI, some interesting information like competing. It correlates with, what do you think, thinking or feeling? I'm guessing that most people would say thinking, and yeah, that's the case. You're seeing that correlation there. Also, accommodating, interestingly, correlates with feeling. Again, what you would expect. It's definitely the case for me. My preference is for feeling. and accommodating tends to be the style that I tend to use maybe a little bit too much.
And Michael, while you're talking about those three, we've had a couple questions come in regarding the assessments and any certification or training for each of the assessments. So could you just speak briefly to what certification is needed for each and maybe where people could get some training or more information on the certification?
Certainly, and I'm going to be a little controversial here. I cannot like to be. So with the Myers-Briggs, if you don't have any graduate work in the use of psychological measurement and assessment, then you have to go through a 4-day certification program. I do that. I do about 20-something of those programs a year. And I think they're wonderful programs, and the feedback we get from people is, wow, life-changing, I had no idea. Now, if you've already gone through that psychometric training, you don't have to go through this certification program. But here's the controversial part. I find that those people who haven't gone through certification tend to be the biggest misusers of type. Now, I know it's controversial, and I say it because my background was in clinical psychology. And if I were to come right out of school and use the Myers-Briggs because I would have been allowed to based on my training, I would have been one of those misusers because I would have thought of the MBTI as a trait measure, that it's telling me how much of something I am, and then I would have misused it. Well, we know, those of us who are certified know that it doesn't tell us that. What it tells us is that we have a preference for one side over the other. We all use both, but we prefer one over the other. So in the certification training, we really help people understand that difference. And so there is a certification required for the MBTI. For the FIRO-B, currently we don't have a public certification program. So if you go through the MBTI certification, you are then allowed to use the FIRO-B. But I always tell people, at least take a look at the video on how to give feedback on the FIRO-B. There is a video on how to give feedback on the FIRO-B and the FIRO-Business. I will admit they are not the most riveting of videos. They're not the type of video that you would put in front of the television and gather your family around with some popcorn and punch and so on, but they at least give you the steps that you need to cover. The TKI, there is no certification required in the United States. There is if you happen to be in Brazil, and that's a long story. It has to do with testing issues and so on, but there is no certification required. However, I would recommend training on it, and that's where you can go to KillmanDiagnostics.com and learn more about. There are some really nice online trainings that you can go through to learn more about that model and how you would use it.
Okay, and I think we have time for maybe one more question, Michael. And let's see, Dora asks, are there any MBTI refresher courses available after you've already gone through certification training?
Yeah, thanks Dora for that question. CPP, you can go to cpp.com where you'll find lots of webinars like this that we do for ongoing training. But there are lots of organizations that are out there that can help add to your, beyond your MBTI certification status, your MBTI Master Practitioner status. So you can go to mbtimasterpractitioner.com. I believe that's the address, but you can also find that if you go to mbtitalk.com, that's my blog, and if you go to the right-hand side, you'll see a link on all kinds of courses that are available for people, a lot of online courses, some in-person. You'll see information about conferences that are held where you can then get hours that can add to your MBTI Master Practitioner status for anybody interested in doing that.
Okay, and we're going to wrap this up since it's 11:30. Thank you again, Michael, for your amazing presentation. I know everyone on our side, at least, really appreciated it, and I hope all the audience did too. And just as a final reminder, look out in your email in a few days, probably Thursday or Friday. We will be sending out an email that has a ton of information, a link to the recording from this webinar, a summary sheet so that all of the articles and blogs that we reference you can read in depth if you'd like to, and basically helping you so that you don't have to take as copious of notes. We took all the notes and we'll send those to you. And I did have one other question that came in that says, an example of exercises you use in training sessions from Tom. It says Tom has left, but just to let everyone know on the phone, we are going to go over one of the training exercises related to conflict in the next webinar, the one on May 13th, about maximizing the use of the TKI. So if you want to sign up for that one, we'll go over some exercises there. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Michael.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
And have a great day. Bye.